The security footage never lies, but sometimes I wish it would. My name is Clara, and I've been a mortician at Westfield Funeral Home for 11 years. In all that time, I've learned to appreciate the quiet dignity of my work, the careful restoration of peace to faces that have known pain, the gentle preparation that allows families one last moment of connection. Room 7B has always been my favorite preparation space. It sits at the end of the hallway, away from the main traffic, with large windows that let in the morning light. The ventilation system hums steadily, and there's something about the acoustics that makes it feel almost sacred. I've prepared hundreds of people in that room, each one treated with the same respect I'd want for my own family. Mrs. Patterson arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, 73 years old, passed peacefully in her sleep, according to her daughter. Natural causes, the certificate read. She had kind eyes, even in death, and silver hair that caught the light beautifully. Her family had requested a simple preparation, just enough to make her look like she was resting. I'd been working alone that morning, as I often do. The funeral home doesn't officially open until 9, but I prefer to start early when the building is quiet and I can focus completely on the person in my care. The preparation took about 3 hours. Mrs. Patterson was cooperative, if I can use such a word. Some bodies resist the process, muscles that won't relax, features that won't settle into peaceful expressions. But she seemed almost eager to look her best for her family. I remember thinking how much she must have loved them, how even in death she wanted to spare them any additional grief. I finished around 11:30, cleaned up my workspace, and moved her to the viewing room, where her family would see her that afternoon. It wasn't until Thursday that I noticed something odd. I'd been reviewing the security footage from earlier that week, standard procedure, after we'd had some minor break-ins in the area. The funeral home's system records everything during business hours and after. I was fast-forwarding through Tuesday morning when something caught my eye. In the corner of the screen, behind my left shoulder, as I worked on Mrs. Patterson, there appeared to be movement. I rewound the footage and watched it again, this time at normal speed. There I was, carefully working on Mrs. Patterson's hair, my back to the camera as I leaned over her. And there, just barely visible in the frame, was what looked like Mrs. Patterson's hand, moving slightly at her side. Not the kind of movement you'd expect from settling tissues or normal post-mortem changes. This was deliberate, fingers curling and uncurling like someone stretching after a long sleep. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe compression artifacts in the digital recording. But I kept watching. At timestamp 10:47, while I was turned away preparing cosmetics, Mrs. Patterson's head moved. Not the slight settling you sometimes see, but a clear turn toward my back, as if she were watching me work. Her eyes remained closed, but there was something about the angle of her head that suggested awareness. The third incident happened at 11:03, just as I was finishing with her hair. I had stepped away to wash my hands at the small sink in the corner. In the reflection of the mirror above the sink, I should have been able to see Mrs. Patterson on the table behind me. But in the security footage, while my back was turned for those 30 seconds, she sat up. Not all the way, but enough that her upper body lifted off the table. She stayed that way for exactly 15 seconds, then lowered herself back down just before I turned around. I watched that segment 17 times. Each viewing made it more real, more impossible to dismiss. Mrs. Patterson had been dead for over 12 hours when I began working on her. Rigor mortis had come and gone. There was no medical explanation for what I was seeing, but there it was, recorded in perfect digital clarity. The strangest part was her expression in those moments when she moved. Even with her eyes closed, there was something peaceful about her face, something almost grateful, like she was checking on my progress, making sure I was taking proper care of her. When she sat up, she seemed to be looking around the room, taking in the morning light, the flowers her family had already sent. There was no horror in it, no sense of distress. If anything, she looked content. I never told anyone about the footage. How could I? The family's viewing went beautifully. Mrs. Patterson looked exactly like she was sleeping, and her daughter held her hand for 20 minutes, telling her mother all the things she'd wanted to say. It was exactly the kind of peaceful farewell I'd hoped to provide. But I can't stop thinking about those moments when she moved. Was she still there somehow, watching me work, making sure I treated her with the dignity she deserved? Or was there something else, something I don't understand about the space between life and whatever comes after? I still use room 7B. I still love the morning light and the quiet acoustics. But now, sometimes, when I'm working alone with someone new, I find myself glancing at the security camera in the corner. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch myself speaking softly to the person on my table, explaining what I'm doing, asking if they're comfortable, because the security footage never lies. And Mrs. Patterson looked so peaceful when she was watching me work. Some nights, the dead are more patient than the living. I'm Miguel, and I've been driving transport for Riverside Memorial Services for 6 years now. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady. And there's something to be said for a job where your passengers never complain about the radio station or ask you to take a different route. Most of my calls come during regular hours: hospitals, nursing homes, private residences where families are waiting. But the overnight calls, those are different. 2 in the morning, 3:30, 4:15. Times when the world feels thin. When you're driving through empty streets with just your headlights and whatever thoughts you brought with you. The call came in at 1:47 on a Wednesday morning in November. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, 86, passed at Mercy General around midnight. The family had requested transport to Henderson Funeral Home for morning preparation. Nothing unusual about the details: natural causes, next of kin notified, all the paperwork in order. I'd made this exact run dozens of times before. Henderson Funeral Home sits on Maple Street, a converted Victorian house that still looks more like someone's grandmother's home than a business. During the day, it's warm and welcoming, with soft lighting and classical music playing in the lobby. But at 2 in the morning, with just the security lights on, it takes on a different character. The shadows are deeper, the silence more complete. I pulled up to the service entrance at the back of the building. Same as always. The funeral director had given me the entry code weeks ago, 4792, and told me to use the back door for after-hours pickups. Standard procedure. But as I walked toward the door, I noticed something odd. The lights were on inside, warm yellow light spilling out through the small windows. And when I tried the door, it was already unlocked. That wasn't normal. Funeral homes are meticulous about security, especially at night. But maybe the director had stayed late. Maybe there was another family situation that needed attention. I called out as I entered, announcing myself like I always do. Miguel, from Riverside Memorial, here for the Vasquez transport. No answer, but I could hear something. A coffee maker gurgling, the soft hiss of a machine finishing its brewing cycle. I followed the sound down the hallway to a small break room I'd never seen before, despite making pickups here for 2 years. Fresh coffee, still steaming, 2 cups set out on the counter, both clean, both waiting. I called out again, louder this time. My voice echoed through the building, but no one responded. The heating system hummed quietly. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the soft tick of a clock, but no footsteps. No human sounds. The preparation room was down the hall, past the viewing rooms and the family consultation areas. I'd never been inside during a pickup. Usually the funeral director meets me at the back door with the deceased already on a transport gurney. But tonight, the preparation room door was wide open. And inside, under the bright fluorescent lights, someone was waiting for me. Mrs. Vasquez sat upright on the preparation table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was wearing the pale blue dress her family had brought to the hospital, and her gray hair was combed back from her face. Her eyes were closed, but there was something about her posture that suggested she was listening, waiting, patient but ready. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Dead people don't sit up on their own. They don't fold their hands. They don't wait patiently while maintaining perfect posture. But there she was, looking for all the world like an elderly woman sitting in a church pew, waiting for services to begin. I approached slowly, my footsteps loud on the tile floor. "Mrs. Vasquez?" I said quietly, feeling foolish even as the words left my mouth. She didn't respond, didn't move, didn't show any sign of hearing me. But when I got close enough to see her face clearly, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. She was smiling. Not broadly, not in any dramatic way, but there was definitely the hint of a peaceful smile on her lips. I checked for vital signs, even though I knew it was pointless. No pulse, no breathing, skin cool to the touch. Mrs. Vasquez was definitely dead, had been dead for over 2 hours, according to the hospital records. But somehow, she had positioned herself on the preparation table, arranged her dress, folded her hands, and settled into that patient, waiting posture. The transport itself was routine. I helped her onto my gurney, secured the straps, loaded her into the back of the van. She was cooperative throughout, if that's the right word. No unexpected movements, no strange weight distributions, just a quiet, cooperative passenger ready for her next destination. But during the drive back to Riverside Memorial, I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror more than usual. The back of the van was dark, just the faint red glow from the taillights reflecting off the metal walls. I couldn't see Mrs. Vasquez from the driver's seat, couldn't confirm that she was still lying peacefully on the gurney, but somehow I had the strongest feeling that she was listening to the radio, watching the streetlights pass by through the small windows, taking in her final ride through the city she'd called home for 86 years. When I arrived at Riverside Memorial, Mrs. Vasquez was exactly as I'd left her, lying flat on the gurney, hands at her sides, that same peaceful expression on her face. The overnight attendant helped me transfer her to cold storage, and I filled out all the usual paperwork. Transport completed at 3:27 a.m. No complications, no incidents to report. But I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm making late pickups. I think about Mrs. Vasquez sitting so patiently on that preparation table, hands folded, ready to go. I think about the fresh coffee brewing in an empty building, the lights left on, the door left unlocked, like someone or something knew I was coming and wanted to make sure everything was ready. Some nights, the dead are more patient than the living, and sometimes I think they're taking better care of us than we realize. The ground doesn't lie, but sometimes it keeps secrets longer than it should. I'm Elena, and I've been the head groundskeeper at Oak Hill Cemetery for 14 years. It's honest work, maintaining the resting places of people who devoted their lives to this community. Every morning, I walk the grounds with my coffee, checking on the headstones, noting which areas need attention, which graves need fresh flowers or maintenance. You develop a relationship with a place like this, learn its rhythms and moods. I know every section, every family plot, every corner where the morning light hits just right. Section 44 is one of the older parts of the cemetery, established back in 1967, when the city expanded the original grounds. It's a peaceful area, shaded by mature oak trees, with a small stone bench where families can sit and remember. The graves there are well maintained, most with simple headstones and regular visitors who leave flowers and small mementos. I've always enjoyed working in that section because the families are so devoted to keeping their loved ones' graves beautiful. Plot 44C has been empty for as long as I can remember. According to the cemetery records, it was purchased in 1989 by a Mrs. Dorothy Chen, but she was never interred there. The story, as far as anyone knows, is that her family moved away and decided to bury her in California, near her children. The plot remained unused, just a small rectangular patch of grass, surrounded by occupied graves. I noticed the headstone on a Thursday morning in late September. It was a simple gray granite marker, about 3 feet high, with elegant lettering that read, Dorothy Chen, Beloved Mother, 1924, 1987. Below her name was a small engraving of roses, and the phrase, forever in our hearts. My first thought was that the family had finally decided to use the plot. Maybe transferred Mrs. Chen's remains from California. It happens sometimes families change their minds, want to bring loved ones closer to home. But there had been no paperwork, no notifications, no work orders for a headstone installation. Cemetery policy requires at least 2 weeks' notice for any new installations, plus permits and inspections. This headstone had simply appeared overnight. I checked with the office immediately. Sarah, our records keeper, pulled up the file for Plot 44C and confirmed what I already knew. No recent activity, no transfer requests, no payments for headstone installation. According to our records, Mrs. Dorothy Chen had never been buried there. The plot remained officially empty, available for future sale. But there was the headstone, solid and real, weathered in a way that suggested it had been there for years. The granite had the same patina as the other markers from the late 1980s. The lettering showed appropriate aging, with just the right amount of lichen growing in the carved letters. If I hadn't walked through Section 44 every day for 14 years, I might have believed it had always been there. I took photographs and measurements, documented everything for the administrative report I'd have to file. The headstone was professionally installed, with proper concrete footings and graded earth around the base. Someone had even planted small marigolds along the front edge, flowers that looked like they'd been growing there all season. The mystery deepened when I decided to probe the ground around the marker. Sometimes families install headstones prematurely, marking plots they intend to use. But when I pushed the probe rod into the earth, it met resistance at exactly 6 feet down, the distinctive resistance of wood, a casket. I called the city cemetery administrator and explained the situation. Within 2 hours, we had a small excavation crew on site. The families in adjacent plots were notified, and we set up privacy screens around the area. If there was indeed a casket buried in Plot 44C, we needed to know how it got there and who was inside. The excavation took most of the afternoon. At 5 feet, we found the first clear evidence, the corner of a metal casket vault, properly sealed and installed according to city regulations. At 6 feet, we uncovered the casket itself, bronze finish, expensive hardware, with a small nameplate that read, Dorothy Chen, 1924, 1987. The casket was in remarkably good condition for being buried over 30 years. No water damage, no corrosion, properly sealed and preserved. When the coroner arrived and we carefully opened it, we found Mrs. Chen exactly as she would have appeared at her funeral in 1987. She was wearing a navy blue dress with small pearl buttons, her hands folded over a bouquet of dried roses. In her hands was a small card that read, My love to Elena, who takes such good care of our garden. I had never met Mrs. Dorothy Chen. I started working at Oak Hill Cemetery in 2009, 22 years after she died. I had never heard her name before finding her headstone, had no connection to her family or her story. But somehow, she knew my name. Somehow, she had left me a message from across the decades. The administrative investigation lasted 3 weeks. City records confirmed that Mrs. Chen had indeed been buried in California in 1987 at Eternal Peace Cemetery in San Francisco. Her death certificate, funeral arrangements, and burial receipts were all properly filed. But the coroner's examination of the remains in Plot 44C confirmed that they were indeed Mrs. Dorothy Chen, age 63, died of natural causes in 1987. The casket in California contained someone else entirely, a John Morrison, who had died the same week, whose family had been searching for his remains for over 30 years. Somehow, Mrs. Chen and Mr. Morrison had been switched, and no one noticed until we found her headstone in Plot 44C. The official report listed it as an administrative error from 1987, a mix-up between funeral homes that went undetected for decades. But that didn't explain how Mrs. Chen's headstone appeared overnight, or how she knew to write my name on a card buried with her 35 years ago. I still walk through Section 44 every morning, Mrs. Chen's headstone is properly registered now, her grave officially recognized and maintained. The marigolds bloom beautifully each season, and I make sure to keep fresh flowers on her grave year-round. Sometimes, when I'm working in that section, I find myself talking to her quietly, telling her about the weather, about the other families who visit, about how peaceful the cemetery is in the early morning. The ground doesn't lie, but sometimes it keeps secrets longer than it should. And sometimes I think the people we care for find ways to let us know they're exactly where they belong. Small changes can reveal the biggest truths. I'm Director Hoffman, and I've been managing Whitmore Funeral Home for 23 years. In that time, I've overseen thousands of viewings, memorial services, and celebrations of life. Each one is different because each family is different, but they all share the same basic elements: a time for people to gather, to remember, to say goodbye. My job is to create an atmosphere where families can grieve properly, where they can find some measure of comfort in the midst of their loss. Mrs. Chen's viewing was scheduled for Thursday afternoon in March. She had passed peacefully at the age of 79, surrounded by her children and grandchildren at Riverside Manor. Her family described her as a woman who loved to laugh, who had spent 40 years teaching elementary school and touched the lives of hundreds of children. They wanted a traditional viewing, nothing elaborate, just a chance for the community to pay their respects to a woman who had given so much to others. The preparation had gone smoothly. Mrs. Chen had been a beautiful woman, with silver hair that caught the light and laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of a life filled with joy. Our mortician had done excellent work. Mrs. Chen looked peaceful, dignified, exactly like someone taking a well-deserved rest. Her family had brought a pale pink dress, her favorite color, and a small pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother. I always check on the viewing room several times during calling hours. It's part of my responsibility to make sure everything is proceeding appropriately, that the flowers are arranged properly, that the guest book is available, that family members have what they need. Mrs. Chen's viewing was well attended. Former students, fellow teachers, neighbors, church members. A steady stream of people paying their respects to a woman who had clearly been beloved in the community. The first time I checked on her, around 2:30, Mrs. Chen looked exactly as she had when we first positioned her in the casket. Peaceful expression, hands folded over a small bouquet of pink roses, head resting comfortably on the satin pillow. Several visitors were standing nearby, sharing quiet stories about her impact on their lives. When I returned at 3:15, I noticed something subtle. Mrs. Chen's expression seemed slightly different, not dramatically, not in any way that would be obvious to casual observers, but there was the faintest suggestion of a smile on her lips, the kind of expression you might wear when overhearing a particularly pleasant conversation. I assumed it was a trick of the lighting. The afternoon sun was streaming through the large windows, casting different shadows than before. By 4 o'clock, the change was more pronounced. Mrs. Chen was definitely smiling, not broadly, not in any inappropriate or disturbing way, but there was a clear upturn to the corners of her mouth. She looked like someone who was genuinely enjoying herself, listening to all the wonderful things people were saying about her life. A few visitors commented on how peaceful she looked, how you could almost imagine she was just sleeping. At 4:30, her expression had shifted again. The smile was wider now, more noticeable, though still within the realm of what might be considered natural variation. But I knew it wasn't natural. I had positioned Mrs. Chen in her casket myself just 3 hours earlier. I had carefully arranged her features to achieve the most peaceful, dignified expression possible. This was something else entirely. I began checking on her every 15 minutes, making notes of each change. By 5 o'clock, Mrs. Chen looked genuinely pleased, like someone listening to their favorite music or watching their grandchildren play. By 5:30, she appeared to be on the verge of laughter, her whole face lit up with joy. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Mrs. Chen was becoming more animated with each passing hour. The strangest part was that none of the visitors seemed to notice. They continued to share their memories, to comfort each other, to celebrate Mrs. Chen's life, all while she lay in her casket with an increasingly joyful expression. Her family mentioned how beautiful she looked, how much the viewing meant to them. But no one commented on the changes I was documenting. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Post-mortem changes in facial expression are not unheard of, though they typically involve settling or relaxation, not the appearance of deliberate emotion. I considered whether the lighting was playing tricks, whether my own stress and fatigue were affecting my perception. But I knew what I was seeing. Mrs. Chen was responding to her own funeral. By 6 o'clock, as the viewing was winding down, Mrs. Chen's expression had reached what I can only describe as absolute delight. She looked like someone who had just heard the most wonderful news, who was barely containing their excitement. Her face radiated warmth and happiness in a way that seemed impossible for someone who had been deceased for 3 days. The last visitors left around 6:30. Mrs. Chen's family spent a few final minutes with her, expressing their love and gratitude for the beautiful viewing. Her daughter held her hand and whispered something I couldn't hear, something that seemed to make Mrs. Chen's smile grow even brighter. After the family left, I remained in the viewing room alone with Mrs. Chen. In the quiet of the empty funeral home, with just the soft lighting and the lingering scent of flowers, I found myself speaking to her quietly. I told her what a lovely viewing it had been, how many people had come to honor her memory, how much love had filled the room throughout the afternoon. As I spoke, Mrs. Chen's expression seemed to soften slightly, settling into something more peaceful, but no less joyful, like someone who had received exactly the gift they'd been hoping for. I stayed with her for another 20 minutes, just talking quietly about her family, about the beautiful things people had said, about how clear it was that she had lived a life worth celebrating. When I returned the next morning to prepare for Mrs. Chen's funeral service, her expression had returned to the peaceful repose we had originally arranged. But there was something different about her overall appearance, something that suggested deep satisfaction, like someone who had attended a wonderful party and was now ready for rest. Mrs. Chen's funeral was beautiful, well attended, filled with laughter and tears and stories of a life well lived. But I keep thinking about that viewing, about the way her expression changed throughout the afternoon as she listened to people celebrate her legacy. Small changes can reveal the biggest truths, and sometimes, I think, the people we're honoring are more present than we realize. Empty spaces can be the loudest places of all. I'm Jake, and I've been working as an embalmer at Memorial Gardens Funeral Home for 8 years. It's detail-oriented work that requires patience, skill, and a deep respect for the people who come into my care. I've always preferred working the night shift, fewer interruptions, quieter environment. Time to focus completely on the process of restoration and preservation that allows families to say goodbye with dignity. The funeral home's cold storage facility has 12 refrigeration units, each one precisely temperature-controlled and monitored around the clock. Units 1 through 11 are used regularly, cycling through occupancy as we receive new arrivals and prepare others for services. Unit 12 has been empty since the renovation 3 years ago, when we upgraded the entire system and discovered some minor electrical issues with that particular compartment. The unit still functions perfectly, maintains proper temperature, door seals correctly, ventilation works as designed. But the funeral director decided to keep it offline until we could address some cosmetic damage inside, scratches on the walls that looked unprofessional. It became one of those projects that kept getting postponed. We had plenty of capacity with the other 11 units, so there was no urgency to repair number 12. I first noticed the knocking on a Tuesday night in October. I was working on Mr. Peterson, a retired carpenter who had passed peacefully at home, surrounded by his family. The preparation was going smoothly when I heard 3 soft knocks, like someone tapping gently on metal. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the cold storage units. But when I paused to listen more carefully, the sound stopped. I checked all 11 occupied units, making sure the doors were properly sealed, that the cooling systems were functioning normally, Everything was in order. I assumed the sound was related to the aging HVAC system, or perhaps settling in the building's structure. Old buildings make noise, especially at night, when temperature changes cause materials to expand and contract. The knocking continued sporadically over the next few weeks, always during my overnight shifts, always seeming to come from the direction of cold storage. 3 knocks. Pause, then silence. Sometimes I would hear it multiple times in a single night, other times, not at all. It became background noise, something I acknowledged but didn't worry about. It was during a particularly busy week in November that I finally identified the source. We had all 11 units occupied, which meant I was spending more time in the cold storage area, moving between preparations and checking on scheduling. That's when I realized the knocking was coming specifically from Unit 12, the empty one. I opened the door and examined the interior carefully. The unit was completely empty, clean, properly ventilated. The temperature gauge showed it was maintaining the same precise climate as the other units, despite being officially offline. I knocked on the walls, checking for loose panels or mechanical issues that might be causing the sound. Everything seemed solid, but the temperature logs told a different story. When I checked the monitoring system, I discovered that Unit 12 had been running consistently colder than the others for the past 6 weeks. Not dramatically colder, but enough to be noticeable, about 8 degrees below the standard setting. The system was compensating by working harder, drawing more power, maintaining a temperature that nobody had requested. I mentioned it to the day shift supervisor, thinking there might be a thermostat malfunction or programming error. She assured me she would look into it, but with everything else going on, it wasn't a priority. Unit 12 wasn't causing any problems, wasn't interfering with our work. If it wanted to run cold, we could live with that until the renovation budget was approved. The knocking became more frequent as winter approached. 3 knocks, always 3, always from inside Unit 12. Sometimes I would hear it while I was working 2 rooms away. Sometimes it would wake me during my break. 3 distinct impacts that seemed to echo through the building's infrastructure. I started keeping a log, noting the time and duration of each incident. What I discovered was a pattern. The knocking occurred most frequently between 2 and 4 in the morning, the hours when the building was most quiet, when the outside world was deepest in sleep, and it always happened in sets of 3, repeated at irregular intervals, like someone sending a message. One particularly cold night in December, I decided to stay with Unit 12 and see if I could understand what was happening. I brought a chair from the office and positioned myself directly in front of the empty compartment. The temperature in the storage area was uncomfortably cold, much more so than usual. My breath was visible in the air, and I could hear the unit's cooling system working overtime. The knocking started at 2:17. 3 clear impacts from inside the unit, metal on metal, deliberate and measured. I knocked back 3 times, the same rhythm. The response was immediate, 3 knocks in return, then silence. I waited 10 minutes and knocked again. Again, 3 knocks answered me. For the next hour, I maintained this conversation with whatever was inside Unit 12. I would knock, and it would respond. Always 3 knocks, always the same timing, always from the same location inside the empty compartment. It felt like communication, like someone trying to tell me they were there, that they were listening. Around 3:30, the pattern changed. Instead of responding to my knocks, the sound began repeating on its own. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, over and over again. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost like a heartbeat, steady and persistent. I found myself synchronizing my own breathing to the sound, feeling strangely comforted by the consistency. The knocking stopped abruptly at 4:07. The cooling system cycled down, the temperature began to normalize, and Unit 12 returned to its usual silence. I remained in the chair for another hour, but there were no more sounds, no more communication. Whatever had been trying to reach me had finished its message. I still worked the night shift at Memorial Gardens. I still hear the knocking from Unit 12, though less frequently now. Sometimes I knock back, maintaining that strange conversation with the empty space. The temperature logs continue to show that Unit 12 runs colder than the others, working harder to maintain a climate that nobody requested. The funeral director keeps talking about renovating Unit 12, about fixing the cosmetic damage and bringing it back online. But I hope she doesn't, at least not yet. There's something comforting about knowing that empty space is being used, even if I don't understand by whom or for what purpose. Empty spaces can be the loudest places of all, and sometimes, I think, they're not as empty as they appear. The handwriting was elegant, but it belonged to no one I knew. I'm Ruth, and I've been the cemetery clerk at Hillside Memorial Park for 19 years. My job is to maintain the burial records, coordinate with funeral homes, and ensure that every interment is properly documented and filed. It's meticulous work that requires absolute accuracy. Families depend on these records for generations, and there's no room for error when it comes to documenting where their loved ones rest. The registry system at Hillside has evolved over the decades. We have ledger books dating back to 1893, when the cemetery was first established, and we've maintained the same careful documentation standards throughout. Each burial is recorded in chronological order, with details about the deceased, the plot location, the funeral home, and the officiating clergy. Every entry is signed and dated by the supervising staff member. I discovered the first unusual entry on a Monday morning in late August. I was updating the weekend's interments when I noticed an entry I didn't recognize in Saturday's log. The handwriting was different from mine or any of my colleagues, more formal, with the kind of careful penmanship you'd expect from someone educated in an earlier era. The entry documented the burial of Margaret Winters, aged 67, in plot section 15, row D. The problem was that Hillside Memorial had been closed that Saturday for maintenance. We'd been resurfacing the main road and had scheduled no services or burials for the entire weekend. I would have known about any emergency interments, and there had been none. Yet there was the entry, written in that distinctive handwriting, signed M. Dalton, Night Supervisor. I checked our current staff roster immediately. We had no employee named M. Dalton. Had never had anyone by that name in my 19 years there. I pulled out the historical employment records, thinking perhaps it was someone from before my time who might have come in for some reason. That's when I found the first reference to Marcus Dalton, Night Supervisor, employed from 1958 to 1962. Marcus Dalton had overseen weekend and evening operations during the cemetery's expansion period in the early 1960s. According to his personnel file, he had been a meticulous record keeper, praised for his attention to detail and his respectful interaction with grieving families. He had left Hillside Memorial in 1962 when his wife became ill, and according to a note in his file, he had passed away in 1974. But there was his signature in Saturday's log, written in the same careful hand I'd seen in the old ledger books from his era. And when I checked section 15, row D, I found fresh earth and a temporary marker for Margaret Winters, exactly as documented. I reported the incident to the cemetery administrator, thinking there must be some explanation, perhaps a former employee with access who had handled an emergency situation. But when we investigated further, we discovered that Margaret Winters had indeed been buried that Saturday, though no one could explain how or by whom. Mrs. Winters had passed away Friday evening at St. Mary's Hospital. Her family had made arrangements with Patterson Funeral Home for a Monday service, but apparently someone had decided she needed to be interred immediately. The grave had been professionally prepared, the casket properly installed, the site carefully restored. Everything had been done according to cemetery standards, but without any official authorization or schedule. The entries continued appearing throughout the fall, always on weekends when the cemetery was officially closed, always in that same distinctive handwriting, always signed by M. Dalton. Each entry documented a real burial people who had genuinely passed away and needed interment, but whose services had been scheduled for later in the week. What troubled me most was the accuracy of the information. M. Dalton's entries included details that only someone with access to funeral home records would know: the deceased's middle names, their exact ages, the names of their surviving family members. But Patterson Funeral Home insisted they had shared these details with no one outside their staff. I began staying late on Friday evenings, hoping to catch whoever was making these entries. The cemetery has security cameras at the main entrance, but they show no unauthorized vehicles entering the grounds during the weekends when the mysterious burials occurred. The maintenance shed remains locked. The office shows no signs of break-in. Yet somehow, these interments are happening without any official oversight. One Friday in November, I decided to spend the entire weekend at the cemetery. I brought sleeping bags and camping equipment, positioning myself in the office where I could monitor the registry books and watch for any unusual activity. The cemetery at night is peaceful but never completely quiet. Wind through the trees, settling sounds from the older mausoleums, the distant hum of traffic from the highway. Around 11:30 on Saturday night, I heard footsteps on the gravel path outside the office. Slow, measured steps, like someone walking with purpose but without urgency. I looked out the window but saw no one, though the footsteps continued for several minutes, seeming to circle the building before fading into the distance. When I checked the registry the next morning, there was a new entry: Thomas Morrison, aged 74, buried in Section 12, Row F. The handwriting was unmistakably M. Dalton's, the signature clear and confident. But I had been awake all night, had heard no vehicles, seen no lights, witnessed no activity that would suggest a burial had taken place. Yet when I walked to Section 12, there was the fresh grave, professionally prepared and carefully maintained. A temporary marker identified it as Thomas Morrison's final resting place, and when I called Patterson Funeral Home, they confirmed that Mr. Morrison had indeed passed away Saturday evening, though his family had scheduled the burial for the following Tuesday. I've stopped trying to understand how M. Dalton continues his work 30 years after his death. The burials he supervises are always appropriate, always respectful, always for people who genuinely need interment. The families involved are grateful that their loved ones have been laid to rest quickly and with dignity, even if they can't explain how it happened. The cemetery administrator has accepted the situation as one of those mysteries that some places accumulate over time. Hillside Memorial has been serving families for over a century, and perhaps some employees develop such a strong connection to their work that they find ways to continue even after retirement. I still maintain the official records, coordinating with funeral homes and documenting scheduled services. But I've learned to expect M. Dalton's weekend entries, and I've come to appreciate the care he shows for the people who come into his charge. His handwriting is always respectful. His records are always accurate, and the families he serves never have cause for complaint. The handwriting was elegant, but it belonged to no one I knew. Now I understand that some knowledge extends beyond the boundaries we think define it, and some dedication to service continues long after the official workday ends. Beauty and decay follow patterns we don't always understand. I'm Director Santos, and I've been managing Eternal Rest Cemetery for 16 years. Part of my responsibility involves maintaining the aesthetic beauty of the grounds, ensuring that the landscaping is appropriate, that families have opportunities to honor their loved ones with flowers and personal tributes, and that the overall atmosphere remains peaceful and dignified. Every cemetery develops its own rhythm of seasonal changes, and I've learned to appreciate the way different areas respond to the cycles of nature. The flower anomaly began in early spring, during what should have been the most vibrant time of year for our grounds. Families had begun their annual tradition of bringing fresh arrangements to commemorate birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays. The maintenance staff had prepared the garden areas, and everything seemed ready for another beautiful season of growth and remembrance. I first noticed the pattern while making my weekly inspection of Section 7, one of our older areas dating back to the 1970s. Mrs. Patterson had brought a lovely bouquet of yellow roses for her husband's grave, fresh flowers from the local florist. arranged in a waterproof vase, exactly the kind of tribute we see throughout the warmer months. But when I returned 2 days later, the roses had turned completely black. Not wilted, not brown, but black. The petals looked as though they had been dipped in ink, though they retained their original shape and texture. The stems remained green and healthy. The water in the vase was clear, but the flower heads themselves had undergone some kind of transformation that I'd never seen before. I assumed it was some kind of environmental contamination, perhaps fertilizer runoff, or a reaction to cleaning chemicals used by the maintenance crew. I removed the affected flowers and made a note to investigate possible causes. But over the next few weeks, the same thing happened to flowers placed on 3 other graves in Section 7. The pattern became clear when I started documenting the affected graves more carefully. All 4 were for people who had died on October 13th. Different years: 1974, 1981, 1987, 1993, but the same date. And the flowers that turned black were always placed during the spring months, between March and May. I researched the history of each grave, thinking there might be some connection between the deceased individuals that would explain the flower reaction. But they seemed to have nothing in common beyond their date of death. Different ages, different causes of death, different families, different funeral homes. The only link was October 13th and the strange effect on springtime flowers. The phenomenon expanded throughout April and May. Every grave in the cemetery for someone who died on October 13th experienced the same flower blackening, but only during spring months. Summer flowers remained unaffected, as did autumn and winter arrangements. It was specifically springtime blooms, roses, tulips, daffodils, lilies that underwent the mysterious transformation. Families began to notice and complain. Mrs. Chen brought fresh flowers for her mother's grave every Sunday, only to find them blackened by Tuesday. The Wilson family spent considerable money on elaborate Easter arrangements, only to discover them transformed into something that looked more appropriate for Halloween than a celebration of resurrection. I consulted with local botanists and agricultural specialists, thinking there might be some scientific explanation for the phenomenon. Soil samples showed normal pH levels and appropriate nutrient content. Water tests revealed no unusual chemicals or contaminants. The flowers themselves, when examined under laboratory conditions, showed no signs of disease, fungal infection, or chemical damage. The blackening appeared to occur at the cellular level, as though the pigment molecules were being systematically altered by some unknown process. But the process was selective, affecting only spring flowers, only on graves of people who died on October 13th, and only during the months of March, April, and May. One family decided to test the limits of the phenomenon. The Rodriguez family had been bringing flowers to their grandfather's grave for 15 years, ever since he passed away on October 13th, 1998. This spring, they brought flowers every few days, experimenting with different types, different sources, different arrangement. Roses from 3 different florists all turned black within 48 hours. Potted plants lasted slightly longer, but eventually succumbed to the same transformation. Artificial flowers remained unaffected, as did dried arrangements and silk flowers. The phenomenon seemed to target only living blooms, only fresh flowers that had been recently cut and arranged. But the strangest discovery came when Mrs. Rodriguez brought flowers from her own garden roses she had grown herself, tended with care, cut fresh that morning. These flowers not only turned black faster than store-bought arrangements, but they seemed to develop an unusual luminescence, as though the black petals were somehow absorbing and reflecting light in ways that natural flowers shouldn't. I began spending more time in Section 7 during the spring months, trying to understand the timing and mechanism of the transformation. The changes never occurred instantly. They seemed to happen gradually over 24 to 48 hours, usually beginning at the petal edges and working inward toward the center of each bloom. And the transformation was beautiful, in its own unsettling way. The blackened flowers retained all their original elegance and grace, but took on an otherworldly quality that was both striking and somehow mournful. Families began to comment that while the black flowers were unexpected, they weren't necessarily inappropriate for a cemetery setting. Some families even began to embrace the phenomenon, bringing white flowers specifically because they knew they would be transformed into something unique and memorable. The contrast between black petals and green stems created arrangements that were unlike anything available from commercial florists. By June, the flower blackening had stopped completely. Summer blooms remained their natural colors throughout the season, and autumn arrangements were unaffected. The pattern held true for winter as well, only springtime flowers, only on October 13th graves, only during the months when new life was supposed to be emerging from winter's dormancy. I've come to think of it as the cemetery's way of remembering October 13th, of marking that date as somehow significant in ways we don't fully understand. The people buried on that date might not have known each other in life, but they share something now, some connection that expresses itself through the transformation of springtime flowers. This year, I've prepared the families whose loved ones died on October 13th. I've explained the pattern, assured them that it's not harmful or disrespectful, and suggested that they might want to consider it as their loved one's way of creating something beautiful and unique from the offerings brought to honor their memory. Beauty and decay follow patterns we don't always understand. And sometimes, the most meaningful tributes are the ones that change in ways we never expected. Some people resist letting go, even when letting go is what they need most. I'm Webb, and I've been a mortician at Riverside Memorial for 12 years. The work requires patience, technical skill, and above all, respect for the people who come into my care. Each preparation is different because each person is different, but the basic process remains consistent: restoration, preservation, and presentation that allows families to say goodbye with dignity and peace. Mr. Kowalski arrived on a Wednesday morning in February. 81 years old, passed peacefully at home, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. Natural causes: according to his physician, his heart simply stopped during an afternoon nap, a gentle end to a long life. His family described him as a man who had always been active, always engaged with the world around him, someone who found it difficult to sit still even in his final years. The preparation began normally. Mr. Kowalski had been a tall man, well-built despite his age, with thick white hair and strong features that spoke of a life spent working with his hands. His family had brought his favorite Navy suit, a white shirt, and a tie with small anchors. He had served in the Navy during the Korean War and remained proud of his service throughout his life. I always begin with positioning and expression, ensuring that the person looks peaceful and dignified before moving on to more technical aspects of preservation. But with Mr. Kowalski, I encountered immediate difficulties. His eyes wouldn't stay closed, despite repeated adjustments and the application of appropriate adhesives. Each time I positioned his eyelids, they would gradually open again, as though he were struggling to wake up from a deep sleep. This isn't entirely unusual in mortuary work. Sometimes muscle tension or dehydration can cause positioning challenges, and there are standard techniques for addressing these issues. But Mr. Kowalski seemed to be actively resisting my efforts, not through any conscious intent, but as though his body retained some memory of his lifelong inability to rest quiet. I spent extra time working with his facial features, using techniques I'd learned over 12 years of practice. But every adjustment seemed temporary. I would achieve the peaceful expression his family expected, only to find it had shifted when I returned from preparing other materials. His eyes would be partially open, his mouth would have moved slightly, his head would have turned a degree or two to one side. I decided to take a lunch break and return with fresh perspective. Sometimes, stepping away from a challenging preparation allows the body to settle naturally, and I hoped that an hour's rest would help Mr. Kowalski achieve the peaceful repose his family deserved to see. When I returned from lunch, Mr. Kowalski had moved significantly. His head was turned toward the preparation room door, and his mouth had opened as though he were about to speak. The positioning was so deliberate, so purposeful, that it looked as though he were greeting someone who had just entered the room. His eyes were fully open, focused on the doorway, with an expression of alert attention. I had never seen post-mortem changes this dramatic or this seemingly intentional. Bodies do settle and shift during preparation, but these changes suggested something more active, more conscious. Mr. Kowalski looked like someone who was waiting for a visitor, someone who had something important to say. I repositioned him carefully, taking extra time to ensure proper muscle relaxation and feature placement. I used every technique in my professional arsenal to achieve the peaceful expression his family expected. But as I worked, I found myself speaking to him quietly, explaining what I was doing, asking for his cooperation in the process. "Mr. Kowalski," I said as I adjusted his eyelids, "your family wants to see you looking peaceful. They want to remember you at rest, comfortable, ready for whatever comes next. You've earned that rest. After 81 years of taking care of everyone else." The positioning held for about an hour. Then, gradually, his features began to shift again. Not dramatically, not in any way that would be obvious to his family, but enough that I could see he was still struggling with the concept of being still, of letting others take care of him for once. I spent the afternoon working with Mr. Kowalski, not just on the technical aspects of preparation, but on helping him understand that it was okay to rest now. I told him about his family's plans for the service, about the Navy Honor Guard that would present the flag to his widow, about how proud his children were of the life he had lived. Gradually, his resistance seemed to diminish. The positioning adjustments held for longer periods. His features settled into more peaceful expressions. His body began to cooperate with the preparation process. It was as though he were learning to let go, accepting that his active, engaged life had reached its natural conclusion. The final positioning was achieved around 5 o'clock. Mr. Kowalski looked exactly as his family would want to remember him: dignified, peaceful, ready for rest. His hands were folded comfortably, his expression serene, his features arranged in the gentle repose that families find comforting during their time of grief. But I remained with him for another hour, just talking quietly about his life, his service, his family. I told him about the preparations for his funeral, about the people who would be attending, about the military honors he would receive. I thanked him for his patience during the preparation process and assured him that his family would be proud of how he looked. Mr. Kowalski's viewing was beautiful. His family commented on how peaceful he appeared, how the preparation had captured exactly the kind of gentle rest they wanted him to have. The Navy Honor Guard performed their ceremony with precision and respect, and his widow accepted the flag with tears of gratitude for a life well lived and properly honored. I still think about Mr. Kowalski sometimes, especially when I'm working with people who seem to have difficulty accepting the end of their active lives. I've learned that part of my job involves not just technical preparation, but helping people understand that rest isn't giving up. It's accepting that they've completed their work in this world and earned the peace that comes after. Some people resist letting go, even when letting go is what they need most. But with patience and respect, even the most active spirits can learn to embrace the rest they've earned. Some conversations continue long after they should have ended. I'm Director Reeves, and I've been running Harmony Funeral Home for 14 years. The building itself dates back to 1928, originally constructed as a private residence before being converted to its current purpose in the 1950s. Like many older funeral homes, it retains much of its original character: hardwood floors, high ceilings, and a basement that serves as storage and office space for records and administrative work. The basement houses our historical files, going back to the funeral home's establishment over 70 years ago. It's also where we keep the old rotary telephone that was installed when the building was first converted. The phone still works perfectly, connected to our main system, though we rarely use it since the offices upstairs have modern digital equipment. It sits on a small desk in the corner, next to filing cabinets full of decades-old funeral records. The calls began in late September, always at exactly 3:17 in the morning. I only knew about them because I'd been staying late to complete quarterly reports, working in the basement office where I could spread out the financial documents without interrupting the daily operations upstairs. The rotary phone's bell is particularly loud in the quiet basement, and when it rang that first time, it startled me from my concentration. I answered expecting a wrong number, or perhaps an emergency call that had been routed incorrectly. Instead, I heard an elderly woman's voice, clear but distant, asking for David Morrison, please. The voice was polite but formal, the kind of careful diction you'd expect from someone educated in an earlier era. I explained that there was no David Morrison at Harmony Funeral Home, that she might have the wrong number, but she insisted that she needed to speak with David Morrison, that it was very important, that he would know what the call was about. When I asked for her name or how I might help her reach the right number, the line went dead. I assumed it was a confused elderly person, perhaps someone with memory issues who had become fixated on reaching someone from her past. It's not uncommon for funeral homes to receive calls from people who are disoriented or struggling with grief-related confusion. I made a note to mention it to the day shift in case there were other unusual calls. The next night, I was again working late in the basement when the phone rang at exactly 3:17. Same voice, same request for David Morrison, same insistence that he needed to take this call. This time I asked more questions: who was calling, what this was regarding, how she had gotten this number, but she provided no additional information, just repeated her request to speak with David Morrison before hanging up. I decided to research the name in our historical records. Harmony Funeral Home has detailed files going back to its establishment, and I thought perhaps David Morrison had been a former employee or a family member of someone we had served. What I found was more extensive than I expected. David Morrison had indeed worked at Harmony Funeral Home, serving as night director from 1968 to 1987. According to his personnel file, he had been responsible for after-hours operations, handling emergency calls, and coordinating with hospitals and nursing homes during overnight hours. He had been highly regarded by families and colleagues alike, known for his compassionate approach to grieving families and his dedication to providing comfort during difficult times. David Morrison had passed away in 1991, 4 years after retiring from Harmony Funeral Home. He had continued to live in the area until his death, remaining connected to many of the families he had served during his 19 years with the funeral home. The calls continued every night for the next 2 weeks, always at 3:17, always the same voice asking for David Morrison, always ending when I explained that he was not available. I began to expect the calls, staying in the basement specifically to answer them, hoping to learn more about who was calling and why. On the 15th night, I decided to try a different approach. When the voice asked for David Morrison, I said, "He's not available right now, but I'm happy to take a message for him. May I ask who's calling?" There was a long pause before the voice responded. "This is Eleanor. Tell David that Eleanor called. He'll know what it's about." "Eleanor," I said carefully, "David Morrison isn't working here anymore. He retired many years ago. Is there something I can help you with?" Another pause, longer this time. "He promised he would take care of everything. He promised he would make sure I was properly buried. I'm still waiting, and I don't understand why it's taking so long." The line went dead before I could respond. But this time, I had enough information to begin a more thorough search of our records. If Eleanor was someone David Morrison had made arrangements for, there should be documentation somewhere in our files. I found Eleanor Davidson's file in the 1986 records. She had pre-planned her funeral arrangements with David Morrison, paying in advance for services that were to be provided when she passed away. The file included detailed instructions for her service, burial plot information, and even specific requests for flowers and music. Eleanor Davidson had died in 1987, just months before David Morrison's retirement. But according to the records, her funeral had never taken place. There was no completion certificate, no burial documentation, No indication that her pre-planned arrangements had ever been carried out. I spent the next day investigating what had happened to Eleanor Davidson. City death records confirmed that she had passed away in November of 1987. But there was no record of burial, no funeral service, no final disposition of her remains. Somehow, Eleanor Davidson had died and been forgotten. Her pre-planned arrangements lost in the transition when David Morrison retired. That night, when Eleanor called at 3:17, I was ready with information. "Eleanor," I said when she asked for David Morrison, "I found your file. I understand what happened, and I want to help you complete the arrangements David promised to make." The silence stretched longer than usual. Then, in a voice filled with relief, she said, "Thank you. I've been waiting so long. David was such a kind man, and he promised he would take care of everything. I knew he wouldn't forget me." It took 3 months to locate Eleanor Davidson's remains and complete the arrangements she had planned 37 years earlier. The city had stored her body in an unmarked section of the municipal cemetery, waiting for family members who never came forward. Her prepaid account at Harmony Funeral Home had enough funds to cover the burial she had requested, plus interest accumulated over the decades. Eleanor's funeral was small but dignified, exactly as she had planned it. The flowers were white lilies, the music was Amazing Grace, and the service was conducted with the same respect David Morrison would have provided if he had still been available to fulfill his promise. The phone calls stopped after Eleanor's burial. The basement is quiet now during my late-night work sessions, the old rotary phone silent on its desk in the corner. But I've kept David Morrison's files accessible, and I've made sure all our current arrangements include backup procedures to prevent anyone else from being forgotten. Some conversations continue long after they should have ended, but sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that help us complete promises that were made long ago. Some passengers make themselves known in ways you don't expect. I'm Bobby, and I've been driving transport for Eternal Rest Services for 9 years. It's straightforward work, picking up deceased individuals from hospitals, nursing homes, and private residences, then delivering them safely to funeral homes for preparation and services. The job requires professionalism, respect for families, and careful attention to vehicle maintenance and safety protocols. Most of the time, it's quiet work, giving you time to think while you navigate the routes you know by heart. My route covers 3 counties, mostly rural areas, where the distances between pickup locations and funeral homes can be significant. I drive a specially equipped van, designed for dignity and safety, with climate control and secure positioning systems that ensure each person is transported with appropriate respect. The back of the van is windowless, except for small observation windows that allow me to check on cargo during transport. The anomaly began during a routine transport in late October. I had picked up Mrs. Helen Carter from Pine Valley Nursing Home, an elderly woman who had passed peacefully during her afternoon nap. The facility staff had been professional and caring, helping me with the transfer and providing all necessary documentation. Mrs. Carter's family had chosen Morrison Funeral Home for services, about a 40-minute drive through rural highways. About halfway through the journey, I glanced in my rearview mirror and noticed something unusual. Instead of seeing the back of my van with Mrs. Carter's covered form on the transport gurney, I saw 2 distinct shapes. There appeared to be someone sitting upright in the back of the van, positioned next to the gurney where Mrs. Carter lay. I pulled over immediately and checked the cargo area. Mrs. Carter was exactly as I had positioned her, properly secured and covered, showing no signs of movement or disturbance. The van was empty except for her and the standard transport equipment. But when I returned to the driver's seat and looked in the rearview mirror, I again saw 2 figures, Mrs. Carter lying on the gurney and someone else sitting beside her. The sitting figure appeared to be an elderly man, though the mirror's angle and the van's interior lighting made it difficult to see clearly. He seemed to be watching the road ahead through the small observation windows, his posture alert and attentive. There was something familiar about his silhouette, though I couldn't place where I might have seen him before. I completed the transport to Morrison Funeral Home without incident. When I opened the cargo doors, Mrs. Carter was alone, exactly as she should have been. I helped the funeral home staff with the transfer, completed all paperwork, and drove back to base. But during the return trip, my rearview mirror showed only the empty cargo area. No unexplained passengers. Nothing unusual. The phenomenon repeated during subsequent transports, but only with certain individuals. Not everyone I transported was accompanied by the mysterious passenger, and I couldn't identify any pattern that would predict when the additional figure would appear. Sometimes it was an elderly man, sometimes an elderly woman, occasionally what appeared to be a younger person, always sitting quietly, always watching the road ahead. I began documenting these incidents, noting the time, weather conditions, route taken, and any distinguishing characteristics of both the deceased person I was transporting and the mysterious passenger who appeared in my mirror. What emerged was a curious pattern. The additional passengers seemed to match the age and general appearance of the people I was actually transporting. During a transport in November, I was moving Mr. James Sullivan from his home to Grace Memorial Funeral Home. Mr. Sullivan had been a career Navy man, retired for 20 years, but still maintaining the bearing and dignity of his military service. As I drove through the countryside, my rearview mirror showed him lying peacefully on the transport gurney, but it also showed an elderly man in what appeared to be a Navy uniform sitting beside him. The uniformed figure sat with perfect military posture, occasionally adjusting his position, but always maintaining that alert, watchful stance that suggested years of naval discipline. During the 45-minute transport, he never looked away from the road ahead, as though he were standing watch during a particularly important voyage. When I mentioned this pattern to my supervisor, she suggested I might be experiencing eye strain or fatigue-related hallucinations. Long-distance driving can play tricks on your vision, especially during the emotional stress of transport work. She recommended I take a few days off and see an eye doctor to rule out any vision problem. The eye examination found nothing wrong with my vision. I took a week off as suggested, spending time with my family and resting from the demands of transport work. But when I returned to my regular route, the phenomenon continued exactly as before. Some transports showed additional passengers in my rearview mirror, others did not, and there seemed to be no medical or logical explanation for what I was experiencing. I began to pay closer attention to the families I served, listening to their stories about the people I was transporting. What I discovered was that the mysterious passengers seemed to appear most often when I was transporting people who had lost their spouses within the previous few years. Mr. Sullivan's wife had passed away 18 months earlier. Mrs. Carter's husband had died 3 years ago. The pattern wasn't perfect, but it was consistent enough to be noticeable. The most remarkable incident occurred during a December transport. I was moving Mrs. Dorothy Kim from the hospital to Sunset Memorial, a routine pickup that should have taken about 30 minutes. Mrs. Kim had been married for 57 years before her husband passed away the previous spring. According to her daughter, she had never quite recovered from his loss, spending her final months talking about how much she missed him and looking forward to being reunited. During that transport, my rearview mirror showed not just Mrs. Kim and a male passenger, but what appeared to be an animated conversation taking place in the back of the van. The elderly man was leaning toward Mrs. Kim's gurney, and while I couldn't see her moving, there was something about his posture that suggested active communication. He would gesture occasionally, nod his head, sometimes appear to be listening intently to something I couldn't hear. The conversation seemed to continue for the entire 30-minute drive. The man's body language suggested joy, relief, perhaps even laughter at times. There was an intimacy to their interaction that spoke of long familiarity, the kind of comfortable communication that develops between people who have shared decades of life together. When I delivered Mrs. Kim to Sunset Memorial, the funeral director mentioned that her family had specifically requested that she be buried next to her husband, that they wanted to ensure she would finally be reunited with the love of her life. The service, he said, would celebrate not just her life, but the beautiful marriage that had sustained both of them through more than half a century together. I still see additional passengers during certain transports, though I've stopped trying to explain or document the phenomenon. The people who appear in my rearview mirror are always quiet, always respectful, always seem to be providing some kind of comfort or companionship during the final journey. They never interfere with my driving, never create any safety concerns, never do anything that would compromise the dignity of the transport process. Some passengers make themselves known in ways you don't expect. And sometimes, the most important part of a final journey is having the right companion along for the ride. The smallest visitors leave the deepest impressions. I'm Luis, and I've been the night security guard at Meadowbrook Cemetery for 7 years. The job involves monitoring the grounds from sunset to sunrise, ensuring that the cemetery remains secure and peaceful during the overnight hours. It's quiet work that allows for reflection, and I've come to appreciate the responsibility of watching over this place, where so many families have laid their loved ones to rest. Meadowbrook Cemetery covers 43 acres of gently rolling hills, with sections dating back to the 1890s. The main entrance has an ornate iron gate that's locked each evening at 6 o'clock and reopened at 7 in the morning. My security booth sits just inside the entrance, positioned so I can monitor both the gate and the main pathways that lead through the cemetery's various sections. The footprints first appeared on a Tuesday morning in early November. I discovered them during my dawn patrol, just before the groundskeeping crew arrived for their daily maintenance. The prints were small, clearly from bare feet, leading from the locked main gate directly to Section 12, where many of the cemetery's youngest residents rest. The prints were perfectly formed in the morning dew, small enough to belong to a child of perhaps 6 or 7 years old. They led in a straight line from the gate to a specific headstone, then simply ended. No return path, no indication of how the visitor had left the cemetery. Just a clear trail from the entrance to one particular grave, then nothing. I checked the gate locks immediately. Everything was secure, exactly as I had left it the previous evening. The cemetery's perimeter fencing showed no signs of disturbance, no areas where someone could have climbed over or crawled under. The footprints had to have been made by someone who had somehow passed through the locked gate, but I could find no evidence of how that might have been possible. The grave where the footprints ended belonged to Timothy Chen, age 7, who had passed away in 2003 from leukemia. According to the cemetery records, Timothy had been an only child, whose parents had moved away several years after his burial. The grave was well maintained by the cemetery staff, but rarely received visitors anymore. I documented the incident in my security log and mentioned it to the cemetery administrator when she arrived that morning. She suggested that perhaps a family member had visited early and I had missed their departure, or that the morning dew had created an optical illusion that made old footprints appear fresh. Both explanations seemed reasonable, and I accepted them as the most likely possibilities. But the footprints appeared again the next morning. Same size, same bare feet, same path from the gate to Timothy Chen's grave. This time I examined them more carefully, noting the clear definition of toes and heel, the appropriate depth for someone of that size and weight. These were definitely fresh prints, made sometime during the overnight hours when the cemetery was locked and supposedly empty. I began staying alert throughout my shifts, monitoring the gate area and the pathways more carefully. The cemetery at night is never completely silent. Wind through the trees, settling sounds from older monuments, the distant hum of traffic from the highway. But I heard no sounds that would suggest a child walking through the grounds. No voices or movement that would indicate an unauthorized visitor. The pattern continued throughout November and into December. Not every night, but 3 or 4 times each week, I would find the small footprints leading from the gate to Section 12. Always to children's graves, always ending abruptly at specific headstones. Never the same grave 2 nights in a row, but always graves marked beloved son or beloved daughter. I started mapping the visits, noting which graves received the mysterious nocturnal attention. What emerged was a pattern of visitation that seemed to focus on children who had been buried alone, without siblings nearby, often in families that had moved away or stopped visiting regularly. The footprints appeared most frequently at graves that looked lonely, that hadn't received fresh flowers or family attention in recent months. One particularly clear night in December, I decided to position myself where I could observe Section 12 directly. I brought a thermos of coffee and a pair of binoculars, settling into a location where I could monitor the children's section without being visible from the main pathways. Around 2:30 in the morning, I saw movement near Timothy Chen's grave. Not clearly, not distinctly, but something small was moving in the shadows between the headstones. The figure appeared to be the right size to create the footprints I'd been finding, moving slowly from grave to grave, pausing at each one, as though paying respects or offering comfort. Through the binoculars, I could make out what appeared to be a child-sized silhouette, though the details remained unclear in the darkness. The figure moved with purpose but without urgency, spending several minutes at each grave before moving on to the next. There was something tender about the movements, something that suggested genuine care and connection. I watched for over an hour as the figure visited 6 different graves in Section 12. At each stop, it would pause, sometimes appearing to sit or kneel beside the headstone, sometimes seeming to place something small near the base of the marker. The visits had a ritual quality, like someone completing important responsibilities with careful attention to detail. When I checked the graves the next morning, I found no physical evidence of the nighttime visits except for the familiar footprints. But there was something different about the graves that had been visited. They looked somehow less lonely, as though they had received the kind of attention that families provide when they come to remember their children. I never mentioned what I had observed that night. How could I explain that I had watched a child-sized figure moving through the cemetery, visiting graves of children, providing some kind of comfort or companionship that I didn't understand? Instead, I continued to document the footprints and accepted them as one of those mysteries that some places accumulate over time. The visits continued throughout the winter, though less frequently during the coldest months. Spring brought an increase in activity, with footprints appearing almost nightly as the weather warmed and the cemetery grounds came back to life. The pattern remained consistent: small, bare feet, straight paths to children's graves, visits that seemed to focus on the loneliest resting places. I've come to think of the mysterious visitor as the cemetery's way of ensuring that no child rests alone, that even the graves that families can no longer tend receive the attention and care that every young person deserves. The footprints are always respectful, always gentle, never disturbing anything or causing any damage. This spring, I've started leaving small toys and flowers near the children's section, thinking that perhaps the nighttime visitor might appreciate having gifts to share during those quiet hours. The items always disappear by morning, and the footprints continue to appear, leading from the gate to graves that need the most attention. The smallest visitors leave the deepest impressions. And sometimes, the most important care is provided by those we never see but always feel. Some bodies remember warmth long after the heart has stopped. I'm Grace, and I've been a mortician at Sunset Memorial for 15 years. The work requires technical precision, emotional sensitivity, and deep respect for the people who come into my care. Each preparation is unique because each person is unique, but the basic principles remain: constant preservation, restoration, and presentation that allows families to find closure and peace during their time of grief. The anomaly began with Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, an 84-year-old woman who had passed away peacefully at home, surrounded by her family. According to her death certificate, she had died of natural causes. Her heart had simply stopped during an afternoon nap, a gentle end to a long and fulfilling life. Her family described her as someone who had never known a stranger, who had spent her life caring for others and spreading warmth wherever she went. The preparation should have been routine. Mrs. Walsh had been a healthy woman despite her age, with good muscle tone and skin condition that would respond well to standard preservation techniques. But when I began the embalming process, I noticed something unusual. Her body temperature was higher than expected for someone who had been deceased for over 12 hours. Bodies typically cool to ambient temperature within hours of death, reaching equilibrium with their environment as circulation stops and metabolic processes end. But Mrs. Walsh's skin remained warm to the touch, not feverishly hot, but maintaining the gentle warmth of someone who was simply sleeping. The temperature was consistent throughout her body, suggesting that whatever was causing the warmth was systemic rather than localized. I checked the preparation room's climate controls, thinking perhaps there was a malfunction with the heating system. But the room was at its normal temperature, comfortable for working, but certainly not warm enough to prevent natural cooling of deceased tissue. Mrs. Walsh's warmth was coming from within, somehow being maintained by processes I didn't understand. The embalming fluid met unusual resistance during injection. Normally, the fluid flows through the circulatory system according to predictable patterns, displacing blood and beginning the preservation process. But with Mrs. Walsh, the fluid seemed to encounter opposition, as though her circulatory system was still functioning on some level, still moving blood through her veins and arteries. I adjusted my technique, using lower pressure and allowing more time for the fluid to distribute naturally. But even with these modifications, Mrs. Walsh's body seemed to be fighting the preservation process, retaining its natural warmth and circulation patterns. The embalming fluid took twice as long as usual to achieve proper distribution, and even then, some areas remained resistant to preservation. Most remarkably, Mrs. Walsh's complexion remained vibrant throughout the process. Instead of the pale, waxy appearance that typically develops during embalming, her skin retained its natural color and elasticity. She looked like someone who was resting comfortably, who might wake up at any moment and ask how long she had been sleeping. I had never encountered anything like this in 15 years of mortuary work. Bodies resist preservation sometimes, usually due to medical conditions or medications that affect tissue chemistry. But Mrs. Walsh had been in good health, taking only standard medications for blood pressure and arthritis. There was no medical explanation for her body's unusual response to the embalming process. I consulted with the funeral director and with colleagues at other funeral homes, describing the situation without identifying Mrs. Walsh by name. The responses were consistent. What I was describing was highly unusual, possibly unprecedented, and might require specialized techniques or additional time to achieve proper preservation. But as the hours passed, something interesting happened. Mrs. Walsh's body seemed to gradually accept the preservation process, slowly allowing the embalming fluid to complete its work. Her warmth persisted, but the circulation resistance decreased, and her tissues began to respond more normally to the preservation techniques. By the end of the day, Mrs. Walsh was properly preserved and ready for viewing, though she retained that unusual warmth and vibrant appearance. She looked like someone who was simply resting, who had found the perfect temperature for comfortable sleep, and had no intention of being disturbed. The phenomenon repeated with other clients over the following months. Not everyone, but specific individuals whose families described them as particularly warm, caring people who had devoted their lives to helping others. Each time, the pattern was the same persistent body warmth, resistance to embalming fluid, retention of natural coloring, and gradual acceptance of the preservation process. Mrs. Margaret Foster, a retired nurse who had spent 40 years caring for patients at the local hospital, maintained her body temperature for over 18 hours after death. Mr. Robert Chen, a teacher who had mentored thousands of students over his career, remained warm to the touch throughout his entire preparation process. The pattern seemed to correlate with the kind of life the person had lived, rather than any medical or physical characteristics. People who had spent their lives giving warmth to others somehow retained that warmth even after death, as though their capacity for caring had become so fundamental to their being that it persisted beyond the normal boundaries of life. I began to approach these preparations differently, taking extra time, speaking to the people in my care, acknowledging their unusual warmth as a sign of the love they had shared during their lives. I found that when I worked with patience and respect, explaining what I was doing and why it was necessary, the preservation process proceeded more smoothly. Mrs. Walsh, I would say as I worked, your family wants to see you looking peaceful and comfortable. They want to remember the warmth you shared with them throughout your life. This preservation process will help maintain your dignity during the viewing, so your grandchildren can say goodbye properly. The bodies seemed to respond to this communication, gradually allowing the embalming process to proceed, while retaining their characteristic warmth. It was as though they needed to understand that preservation wasn't about taking away their warmth, but about maintaining their dignity and appearance for the families who loved them. Mrs. Walsh's viewing was beautiful. Her family commented on how lifelike she appeared, how she still radiated the warmth and love that had defined her personality. Her grandchildren were able to say goodbye without fear, comforted by her peaceful appearance and the sense that she was still somehow present, still caring for them, even in death. I've come to think of this phenomenon as the body's way of holding onto what matters most. The capacity for warmth, for connection, for caring that some people develop so fully during their lives that it becomes part of their physical being. The warmth these people retain isn't just temperature. It's the essence of the love they shared with others. Some bodies remember warmth long after the heart has stopped. And sometimes, the most beautiful preparations are the ones that allow that warmth to shine through, reminding families that love persists even when life ends. Music has a way of calling to those who understand its meaning. I'm Dennis, and I've been the maintenance worker at Sacred Heart Funeral Home for 11 years. My responsibilities include building maintenance, groundskeeping, and ensuring that all systems function properly during overnight hours when the funeral home is closed to visitors. It's steady work that allows me to take pride in maintaining a place where families come during their most difficult times. Sacred Heart was built in 1932, originally as a private residence for the Morrison family, before being converted to its current purpose in 1958. The building retains much of its original grandeur: high ceilings, elaborate woodwork, and a small chapel with an antique pipe organ that still functions beautifully despite its age. The organ was installed when the building was converted to a funeral home, donated by the Morrison family in memory of their daughter Catherine, who had been an accomplished pianist before her death in 1956. The instrument is a modest but elegant piece, with 2 manuals and a pedal board that produces rich, warm tones, perfect for funeral services and memorial ceremonies. I first heard the music on a Wednesday night in early October. I was checking the heating system in the basement when the sound of organ music drifted down from the chapel above. Someone was playing "Abide With Me," the hymn that families often request for funeral services. The performance was skilled and sensitive, with the kind of nuanced expression that comes from years of experience. My initial assumption was that someone had stayed late to practice for an upcoming service. The chapel is sometimes used for rehearsals, and it's not unusual for musicians to work during evening hours when the building is quiet. But when I checked the chapel, I found it empty, the organ bench vacant, the instrument silent. I examined the organ carefully, thinking perhaps there was some mechanical issue causing it to play on its own. But the power switch was in the off position. The keys showed no signs of movement, and there was no obvious explanation for the music I had heard. The chapel was exactly as it should be: quiet, empty, prepared for the next day's services. I returned to my maintenance duties, assuming I had misheard something, or that sound from outside had created an auditory illusion. But around midnight, I heard the music again, the same hymn, played with the same skilled touch, drifting through the building's corridors with crystal clarity. This time I moved quickly to the chapel, hoping to catch whoever was playing. But again, I found the room empty, the organ silent and switched off. The music stopped the moment I entered the chapel, as though the performer had noticed my approach and decided to pause their practice session. I decided to position myself where I could observe the chapel without being seen, thinking perhaps someone was entering through a side door or window that I hadn't considered. The building has several entrances, and it's possible that someone with legitimate access was coming in to practice without my knowledge. I settled into the main hallway with a clear view of the chapel entrance. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, the music began again. Abide with Me, played with gentle reverence, each note clear and properly timed. But the chapel remained empty, the organ bench unoccupied, no visible performer at the instrument. I approached slowly, staying in the shadows of the hallway, watching for any movement or sign of who might be playing. As I got closer, I could see the organ clearly. The keys were moving, the stops were properly set, the music was definitely coming from the instrument itself. But there was no one sitting at the bench, no hands on the keyboards, no feet working the pedals. The music continued for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, the length of time it takes to play all 4 verses of Abide With Me at the appropriate tempo for a funeral service. When the final note faded, the keys stopped moving, and the chapel returned to its normal silence. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, trying to process what I had witnessed. The organ had definitely been playing. The music had been real and beautiful, but there had been no human performer. The instrument had somehow operated itself, producing music with skill and sensitivity that suggested years of training and experience. The phenomenon repeated every few nights, always the same hymn, always played with the same reverent touch. I began to time the performances, noting that they occurred most frequently around midnight and always lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The music was never mechanical or repetitive. Each performance had subtle variations in tempo and expression that indicated genuine musical understanding. I researched the history of the organ and the Morrison family, thinking there might be some connection that would explain the mysterious performances. What I learned was that Catherine Morrison, the young woman in whose memory the organ had been donated, had indeed been an accomplished musician. According to newspaper accounts from 1956, she had been the organist at St. Luke's Episcopal Church and had been known for her beautiful renditions of traditional hymns. Catherine Morrison had died in a car accident just 3 weeks before her wedding. She had been practicing for her wedding ceremony, working on the musical selections she had chosen for the service when the accident occurred. Abide With Me had been one of her favorite hymns, a piece she often played during funeral services at St. Luke's. The performances became more frequent during November and December, occurring almost nightly as we entered the season when families often gathered to remember loved ones who had passed away. The music was always respectful, always appropriate, always played with the kind of sensitivity that brought comfort rather than fear. One night in late November, I decided to sit in the chapel during one of the performances. I positioned myself in the back pew and waited for the music to begin. When it started, I found the experience surprisingly peaceful. The hymn was played with such skill and reverence that it felt like attending a private memorial service. As the music played, I noticed something remarkable. The organ bench showed a slight depression, as though someone were sitting on it. The impression was subtle but consistent, the kind of settling that occurs when a person takes their position at an instrument. During the performance, I could almost sense a presence at the organ, someone devoted to their music and determined to continue sharing their gift. When the final note faded, I said quietly, "Thank you, Catherine." That was beautiful. The chapel remained silent, but the organ bench gradually returned to its normal position, and I felt a sense of acknowledgement, as though my appreciation had been heard and accepted. I still hear Catherine's performances during my overnight shifts at Sacred Heart. The music has become part of the building's rhythm, a gentle reminder that some forms of beauty persist long after the people who created them have moved on. Families who visit during the day sometimes comment on the peaceful atmosphere in the chapel, the sense that it's a place where music and memory combine to provide comfort. Music has a way of calling to those who understand its meaning. And sometimes, the most beautiful performances are the ones that continue long after the final curtain played by those who cannot bear to let their gift fade into silence. Time moves differently when you're dealing with documentation that shouldn't exist. I'm Patricia, and I've been the records keeper at Riverside County Coroner's Office for 22 years. My job involves maintaining accurate documentation of all deaths in the county, ensuring that death certificates are properly filed, and providing access to historical records for legal and administrative purposes. It's detail-oriented work that requires absolute precision. These documents become part of people's family histories and have legal implications that can last for generations. The coroner's office maintains paper files going back to 1897, when the county was first established. We've gradually digitized most records, but the original documents remain in our archive room, carefully organized by date and cross-referenced by name and case number. The filing system has remained consistent for over a century, making it relatively easy to locate any specific document when needed. I discovered the first anomalous death certificate on a Monday morning in late February. I was filing weekend documents when I noticed a certificate that didn't belong in the current batch. The document was for Jonathan Mitchell, aged 43, listed as dying of natural causes on March 15th. The problem was that it was only February 28th. The death certificate was documenting something that hadn't happened yet. The certificate appeared to be authentic in every way. The paper was the correct type, the formatting matched our standard templates, and all required fields were properly completed. Most significantly, it was signed by Dr. Morrison, who had served as county coroner for 15 years before retiring last spring and passing away the previous month. I checked our computer system to see if Jonathan Mitchell was a real person, thinking perhaps there had been some kind of data entry error that created a certificate with the wrong date. What I found was that Jonathan Mitchell was indeed a county resident, very much alive, with no pending medical issues or circumstances that would suggest imminent death. I brought the certificate to my supervisor, explaining that it appeared to be misfiled or perhaps created in error during our recent system updates. She examined the document carefully and agreed that it was unusual, but suggested that it might be a training document or template that had been accidentally processed as a real certificate. We decided to monitor the situation and see if Mr. Mitchell actually passed away on March 15th. If the certificate proved to be accurate, we would need to investigate how such documentation could be created before the death actually occurred. If March 15th passed without incident, we would file the certificate as an administrative error and take steps to prevent similar mistakes. Jonathan Mitchell died on March 15th, exactly as documented in the certificate that had appeared 17 days earlier. Natural causes: heart attack during his morning run, discovered by his wife when he failed to return home. The circumstances matched the pre-existing certificate perfectly, down to the time of death and the attending physician who pronounced him deceased. I was assigned to investigate how the certificate had been created in advance. The signature analysis confirmed that it was indeed Dr. Morrison's handwriting, despite the fact that he had died the previous month. The paper showed appropriate aging for a document that had been filed weeks earlier, with creases and handling marks that couldn't have been artificially created. The second premature certificate appeared in April, documenting the death of Eleanor Rodriguez, aged 79, scheduled to die of pneumonia complications on May 3rd. Again, the certificate was signed by Dr. Morrison, properly formatted, and filed in the appropriate location within our archive system. Mrs. Rodriguez was indeed admitted to the hospital on April 28th with pneumonia symptoms. Despite aggressive treatment, her condition deteriorated, and she passed away on May 3rd at exactly the time documented in the certificate that had appeared 3 weeks earlier. The pattern continued throughout the spring and summer. Certificates would appear in our filing system, documenting deaths that were scheduled to occur weeks in the future. Each certificate was accurate, properly signed by Dr. Morrison, and filed in the correct chronological location. The deaths they documented always occurred exactly as predicted, with no variations in timing, cause, or circumstances. I began checking the filing system daily, looking for new certificates that might appear overnight. What I discovered was that the documents seemed to materialize during the early morning hours, sometime between 2 and 6 a.m., when the office was empty and locked. Security cameras showed no unauthorized entry, no one accessing the filing cabinets, no explanation for how the certificates were appearing. The certificates only documented natural deaths, heart attacks, strokes, complications from age-related illnesses. Never accidents, never violence, never anything that would suggest unnatural or premature death. It was as though Dr. Morrison was continuing his work from beyond, documenting the inevitable deaths that were part of the natural order of life. I decided to test the system by staying overnight in the office, hoping to observe how the certificates appeared. I positioned myself where I could monitor the filing area without being obvious, bringing coffee and reading material to stay alert during the long night hours. Around 3:30 in the morning, I heard the soft sound of paper being handled, filing cabinets opening and closing, footsteps moving through the archive room. When I investigated, I found a new certificate in the proper filing location. Margaret Thompson, aged 88, scheduled to die of natural causes on August 27th. The certificate was warm to the touch, as though it had just been completed, and I could detect the faint scent of the cologne that Dr. Morrison had always worn. The filing cabinet was properly closed, the documents around it undisturbed, everything exactly as it should be, except for the addition of one new death certificate. Mrs. Thompson passed away on August 27, exactly as documented. Her family mentioned that she had been in declining health but stable condition, and that her death had come as a surprise despite her advanced age. The attending physician noted that while her death was natural and expected given her condition, the timing had been difficult to predict with any accuracy. I've stopped trying to understand how Dr. Morrison continues his work, or why he chooses to document these particular deaths in advance. The certificates he provides are always accurate, always helpful for families who need prompt documentation, and always respectful of the people whose final moments he records. The county administrator has classified the situation as an administrative anomaly that requires no action as long as the documentation remains accurate and helpful. We've established protocols for handling the premature certificates, ensuring that they're properly filed and readily available when the documented deaths occur. I still check the filing system each morning, looking for new certificates that might have appeared overnight. When I find them, I make note of the predicted dates and circumstances, then wait to see how accurately Dr. Morrison's continued work proves to be. His dedication to proper documentation apparently extends beyond the boundaries we thought limited all professional responsibilities. Time moves differently when you're dealing with documentation that shouldn't exist. But sometimes, the most important work is the kind that continues, even when the person doing it has moved beyond the realm where such work should be possible. The final wishes of the departed deserve attention, even when they come from unexpected sources. I'm Director Knox, and I've been managing Greenwood Funeral Home for 18 years. The work involves coordinating every aspect of funeral services, from initial family consultations through final interment, ensuring that each service honors the wishes of the deceased and provides comfort for grieving families. Every detail matters when people are saying goodbye to someone they love. The handwritten notes began appearing on my desk in early September, always overnight, always requesting specific changes to burial arrangements for services scheduled that day. The handwriting was different for each note, but they all shared the same respectful tone and attention to detail that suggested genuine concern for proper funeral arrangements. The first note appeared on a Tuesday morning, written in elegant cursive script on cream-colored paper. Dear Director Knox, it read, I would be grateful if you could move my burial location to plot 47A, Section 3, where I can see the old oak tree. The view would bring me comfort during services. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, Eleanor Patterson. Mrs. Patterson was scheduled for burial that afternoon in Plot 23B, Section 5, the location her family had selected and paid for weeks earlier. But when I checked our cemetery maps, Plot 47A was indeed available, located near the magnificent oak tree that had been the cemetery's centerpiece for over a century. The plot offered a beautiful view and would be an appropriate resting place for anyone who appreciated natural beauty. I called Mrs. Patterson's daughter to discuss the request, explaining that we had received a note suggesting the burial location be changed. She was surprised but not upset, mentioning that her mother had always loved that particular oak tree and had often sat beneath it during visits to the cemetery before her own passing. The family agreed to the change, and Mrs. Patterson was buried in Plot 47A as requested. The service was beautiful, conducted in the shadow of the oak tree, with sunlight filtering through the leaves in a way that seemed to bless the proceedings. Mrs. Patterson's daughter commented that the location felt perfect, exactly where her mother would have wanted to rest. The second note appeared the following week, written in a different hand, but with the same respectful tone. Director Knox, I hope you might consider moving my service to the smaller chapel rather than the main sanctuary. I was always more comfortable in intimate settings, and I believe my family would appreciate the cozier atmosphere. Thank you, Robert Chen. Mr. Chen's service had been scheduled for the main sanctuary. To accommodate the large number of expected attendees, he had been a beloved teacher, with hundreds of former students planning to attend. But when I mentioned the request to his family, they immediately understood. His wife explained that Robert had always preferred small gatherings, that he would have been overwhelmed by a large service despite the honor it represented. We moved the service to the smaller chapel and arranged for overflow seating in the main sanctuary, with video connection for those who couldn't fit in the primary location. The result was exactly what Mr. Chen seemed to have wanted: an intimate service for close family and friends, with the larger community able to participate while maintaining the personal atmosphere he would have preferred. The notes continued throughout the fall, each one requesting reasonable modifications that improved the funeral arrangements in ways the families hadn't initially considered. A request for different flowers because the deceased had been allergic to lilies. A suggestion to include a specific piece of music that held special meaning. A request to change the timing of a service to avoid conflicting with a grandchild's school play. Each note was signed by the person whose funeral was being arranged, written in handwriting that seemed to match their personality and background. Teachers wrote in the neat script they had used on blackboards. Elderly women used the formal cursive they had learned in school decades earlier. Younger people wrote in the casual style of their generation. I began to anticipate the notes, checking my desk each morning to see what requests might have appeared overnight. The suggestions were always thoughtful, always focused on making the service more meaningful for the families involved. It was as though the deceased individuals were continuing to care for their loved ones, making sure their final services provided maximum comfort and healing. One particularly touching note came from Margaret Foster, a young mother who had passed away unexpectedly, leaving behind 2 small children. Her note requested that the children be allowed to place their favorite toys in the casket with her, and that the service include a reading from their favorite bedtime story rather than traditional religious texts. The family had been struggling with how to help the children understand and participate in their mother's funeral. Mrs. Foster's suggestion provided exactly the guidance they needed, creating a service that allowed the children to say goodbye in a way that made sense to them while honoring their mother's memory. The most remarkable note appeared in November from Mr. James Sullivan, a veteran whose family had been unsure about military honors. His note requested that the honor guard ceremony be included, explaining that while he had never talked much about his service, it had been an important part of his life, and he would be honored to be recognized by his fellow veterans. Mr. Sullivan's family had debated whether to request military honors, uncertain whether he would have wanted that kind of attention. His note gave them the confidence to contact the Veterans Organization, resulting in a moving ceremony that celebrated his service and provided closure for both his family and his military colleagues. I've learned to trust the requests that appear on my desk each morning, treating them as legitimate communication from people who remain concerned about their family's well-being. The suggestions are always appropriate, always helpful, and always result in services that better serve the needs of grieving families. The funeral home staff has accepted the situation as one of those mysteries that some places develop over time. We've established protocols for handling the overnight requests, verifying that suggested changes are possible and appropriate before implementing them. The families we serve appreciate the extra attention to detail, even when they don't fully understand how we know exactly what modifications would be most helpful. I still find handwritten notes on my desk most mornings, each one offering suggestions that improve the day's services in ways I might not have considered on my own. The requests continue to be signed by the deceased individuals whose funerals we're arranging, people who apparently remain invested in ensuring their families receive the comfort and support they need during their time of grief. The final wishes of the departed deserve attention, even when they come from unexpected sources. And sometimes, the most important guidance comes from those who understand better than anyone what their families need to find peace.